So welcome back to those who joined us last time or who have joined us before for looking at a bit of the Zohar. This is turning into kind of a routine thing at Sam's. I think the first time I offered to look a little bit at the Zohar, it was kind of a very marginal thing. And there were only a few people who thought, oh, this might be interesting. And slowly it's grown to involve quite a few people, which I'm very glad for, because it really is an interesting and fascinating text. Hello, Martin.
Hi.
Hi. Oh, at the beach. So the key thing, and I'll say a little bit about the Zohar itself, which I kind of do every time, but I don't want to do a little bit too much because otherwise we get too trapped up in the details. Hi, Jackie. Welcome, Jackie. Hello, Lee. Hello. So really quick, and what I'm going to do, as I did last time, is post the link. Hi, David. Nice to see you. The link here has the source sheet, which we'll be using if you want to look at it in your own computer as well. I'll also screen share it in a minute. So the Zohar is a very, very complex book, and I'm happy to answer any questions about what kind of book it is. But one key thing is that it's got lots of different layers of narrative. And the passage we looked at last time together was not narrative at all. It was explicatory. It was looking at a Torah portion at a particular verse and trying to explain what it means. Other passages in the Zohar are much more narrative, actually kind of a story. And that's one of the ones that we're going to look at this evening, is rather an interesting story about a rabbi who goes to heaven and comes back to share the tale of it. So any questions before we start? If anyone hasn't spent some time with the Zohar before, or has any questions about what it is we're looking at, or anything I say and what it means, before we just dive into looking at the text? No? Okay. I don't think you need much background actually for today's, although we'll explain as we go. So hopefully you'll be able to see it up on the screen there. And there's two pieces actually I wanted to talk about. One is this first piece, which is relatively short, which is what links us to this week's parasha, or actually last week's parasha, which Mishpatim. And the Zohar has a very long section called Sava de Mishpatim, meaning the old man of Mishpatim, in which an old man shows up in the narrative structure and talks to the rabbis who are the protagonists and explains to them all these mysteries, all of which have to do with reincarnation. The Zohar is the first place where reincarnation is really taught explicitly in a Jewish text. It's referenced earlier, but 13th century Spain, which is when the Zohar really is put together, is where it first is actually written down as a Jewish doctrine. And it comes primarily through this text of Sava de Mishpatim. This is just a very small piece of it, but it gives us a flavor of how the Zohar is thinking about death and about reincarnation and about what it means to live many lives in one way or another. It's quite hard on Zoom, I think, to do what we normally do, which is discuss, but I don't want my voice to be the one heard the whole time. So I'm going to invite other people to read, if that's okay, at least for parts. I'll interrupt you, and we should have a chance to discuss as well. Anytime you want to ask a question, just shout out with a question. If on most Zooms, you can just hold down the space bar while you talk and it'll take you off mute for a moment. So it's very easy just to jump in if you want to. But Lorraine, would you mind reading for us from the beginning here, just so we get a little flavor of Sava de Mishpatim? You're on mute. Gotta take yourself off mute first. Lorraine. There we go. We got you.
Okay. Come and see. If a man takes another wife, he must not deprive the first one of food, clothing, and conjugal rights. Exodus 21:10. How great and supernal the cycles revolving in this verse. For all souls enter a cycle, and human beings do not know the ways of the Blessed Holy One. How the scales stand, how humans are judged every day at all times, and how souls stand in judgment before they enter this world and after leaving this world. How many revolutions, how many concealed actions does the Blessed Holy One perform with souls? How many naked spirits roam that world, not entering the curtain of the King? How overturned by them is the world, how overturned by countless sealed wonders, and human beings do not know or notice, and how souls whirl like a stone in a sling, as it is said, the souls of your enemies, God will sling them from the hollow of a sling.
All right, thank you, Lorraine. Little passage, bookended by two biblical verses. Let's look at the first biblical verse, which is Exodus 21:10, which is actually from Mishpatim, where we're reading right now in the Torah. If a man takes another wife, he can't deprive the first wife of food, clothing, and sex. These are the three halachic obligations a man owes to his wife. If he fails to do any one of these three, then the court can grant her a divorce unilaterally. What is it about this verse which is prompting them, the old man of Mishpatim, to go on this kind of very dramatic tirade about how we don't understand the cycling of souls at all? What is it? What's the key piece? It's not obvious, by the way. This isn't a trick question. It's really not obvious.
Is he trying to say that it's natural that that a man would take another wife, that it's part of the cycle, that people do go ahead and that's what they do because that's what the soul does? It moves from one to another.
Ooh, interesting. I like that, David. It's. I think, and it may be that it's natural, but I think actually in some ways it's saying that it's unnatural just as much. Because the thing that's under this question is, how can a man take another wife? Because if you start out with the assumption of what we might call soulmates, which the Zohar does, that when a soul enters the world, it's split into a male and a female version, heteronormative, yes, but split into a male and female version, which is then reunited in a married couple, then the question of taking a second wife doesn't make sense in their scheme of soul. How could it be, if you have one matching partner, that you can then add another partner? How could that possibly work? And I think that's what provokes this statement, which is very much just drama, right? There's no teaching here. This is just someone exclaiming how complicated the system of cycling is. The language here, the word reincarnation isn't here, but that's what we're talking about, right? The revolutions, the revolving, cycling souls. That language in Hebrew is gilgul, which is to cycle or to return or to revolve or whatever else, which is what we use to refer to the idea of reincarnation. Gilgulei haneshamot, the cycling of the souls, right? Soul cycling. Not the thing where you're sitting on a stationary bike in a soul cycle. I don't know if they have that here. It's very popular in the States. And it's basically Peloton. That's not what we're talking about. But it is quite literally soul cycling, right? That a soul is going to be going around and around and around, which we understand as reincarnation.
Can I just, if a man is potentially producing more children with several women, then those children continue the cycle. So it's a process of, in the same way I'm thinking of, you have one male and several females to produce more children and to continue the cycle.
Yeah, so there is a very literal piece of this about genetics, no doubt. But the assumption is ultimately that it's a question of how can a soul be matched up with more than one other soul? How does that work? And it doesn't obvious here, but they get onto a discussion as well as what happens when a partner dies and someone remarries, something which happens all the time. And often in those situations, people question, which one was I meant to be with? Right? Was it the first one or the second one? And the Zohar is trying to explain that kind of thinking by going, well, it's not one or the other, it's both, because of the complexity of the way in which souls reincarnate. Maybe the one that left because the one that comes back. And also, Jackie, a topic we seem to come to often when you're here, levirate marriage comes up quite a bit in this, because they're explaining the notion of levirate marriage, which is the biblical institution that a man, if he dies, his brother has to marry the wife that he leaves behind in order to continue on the legacy, by saying that literally it's about drawing down the same soul, recycling the soul that left by virtue of this institution of keeping it within the family. So they are interpreting these real situations in metaphysical ways, no doubt.
So if I can go back, interesting, because the fact that he's using different words here in the sentence, for all souls enter a cycle and human beings do not know the ways of the Blessed Holy One. So the way of the Blessed Holy One, according to the Zohar, should be that all souls find their soul mate. But here we're talking about human beings. So the question is, souls find the soulmate, but human beings don't know that that's what's supposed to be happening to them.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a big idea that actually we don't understand what we're participating in, right? That we're kind of unwittingly involved in all of these complex metaphysical cosmic maneuvers of all these souls, and we don't even have any grasp of it whatsoever, right? That's the key theme here in this exclamatory way, is how dramatically complex the system of souls is. Now, this might not seem radical to us, right? Because maybe some of us think about this already. But actually, in the context of Judaism at the time, this would have been quite a radical statement, because the assumption would have been a much more normative: you live, you die, your soul moves on to some other world. Whereas the notion that the souls are continually recycling through the world in different people, in different forms, in different types of beings, in different times, it's complicated and messy, but it's also very attractive to the mystical assumptions that Zohar wants to make, which is what we're going to see a little bit as well in the story, which is somewhat connected to this. Now, the last verse has nothing to do, by the way, with souls, but is from the book of Samuel, talking about a military engagement in which it's used as a metaphor, right? That you're going to be so fierce that your enemy souls are going to get slung like the hollow of a sling. What exactly is that describing? Anyone ever seen kind of ancient slingers in warfare? How do they work? Yeah, Jackie's got it, right? Right? It's not David and Goliath is in the movies always depicted incorrectly with the kind of like, with the Y bowed thing that you pull back. That's not the sling that's talking about in the Torah. It's talking about something where you get a huge amount of momentum by slinging it over your head, more like track and field version. Not is it shot put? Something like that? Are you slinging it around and around and around? Hammer, right? Okay, thank you. And then you let it go and you have the momentum of that. That's the image they want us to have about souls, right? Is that they have this kind of gravity to them and inertia to them, that they're constantly moving through the world and out of it and back into the world. And that means that it's very, very complicated for us to try and understand what's happening. And the Zohar isn't encouraging us to try. It's just encouraging us to accept that it's so complex, we can't possibly get a grasp of it.
I was wondering, though, that last bit says about the soul of your enemies, God will sling from a hollow of a sling. But then the sentence before seems to imply it's all souls. But that one says only the souls of your enemies. So how can it be a direct comparison?
Well, it's just using the image, really. It just wants to have this image of the hollow of the sling. And that's what the key thing is, the like, right? How souls whirl like a stone in the sling. And the proof of that is this verse where it talks about souls swinging like in a sling. So it's not attempting to read it literally, that it's in particular just that context, but just going to show they're trying to prove what we're saying is something that's talked about elsewhere, even though that's not actually what the verse means, right? In the context of that verse, it's not at all about metaphysics, about what happens after you die. It's just about someone being really good at slinging stuff in warfare. But the Zohar doesn't care, right? It doesn't care about the context. It's willing to take the Torah out of context in every single way and play with it, which is typical of rabbis.
Is it actually criticizing the Exodus verse? Is it actually saying, that's not quite how it is? Is that what the tone of it means? Is that?
I think it's actually, it's hard to say for sure because it's not necessarily very clear. But I think the point of this whole passage is much longer, really, and there's a lot of context, is to try and explain why this law exists, right? Why do you need to say, if you take another wife, you still can't deprive the first one of food, clothing, and conjugal rights? And the metaphysical analogy they're drawing is that even if someone's partner passes away or someone is polygamous and takes two partners, right, the soul matching is still possible, right? Just because you go to that one doesn't mean you stop going to the other one. And just because you take a second wife doesn't mean you stop with the rights that you owe to the first one. And this introduces the idea of how souls can continue even after death, because they see it as something which, even if there was a relationship, the soul still is preserved by virtue of that relationship in a very strange and hard to understand and very unscientific way. So I don't think it's criticizing as much as it's trying to justify why this verse needs to be taught. Of course, for the Zohar, it's not about practical rules of society. This is a very useful one, right? You can't just go taking wives willy-nilly and ignoring the old ones. You have to actually do the work of making sure you're taking care of all of them. But the Zohar doesn't care about the practical halacha. It cares about seeing it as a metaphysical teaching.
Adam, does it imply, well, does it question whether there's a sort of one-to-one match of souls to human life? So does it sort of question that assumption that we are one soul during our sort of time on Earth, if you like?
Absolutely. And that's really hard for us to get a grasp of, I think, because those of us who think in terms of soul think in terms of I have a body and I have a soul, full stop. The Zohar isn't thinking that way. You're right, Robin. It is poking holes in that. And in particular, it does it in a few ways. One is that it introduces the idea that the soul has multiple pieces, and that you can have some pieces at different times in your life or missing pieces. And if you do something really bad, you lose a piece. It's proper like J.K. Rowling, Voldemort, Horcruxes stuff, right? That you can actually do something to lose part of your soul. It also introduces the idea that you can, at certain times, in certain ways, take on other souls. So there's both positive and negative connotations to that, including spirit possession. Right, so the Zohar has a whole notion of spirit possession, meaning that you might be possessed by a soul of someone who's died, which can join and add into your soul, and it gets all jumbled up, and there's a fight for control, and that's how they explain possession, and as a result, having a whole institution of exorcism. And there's positive possession as well. They have a whole notion that if you kind of pray to the right people, the ancestors can come and possess you. Something which, by the way, feels very not monotheistic to us, or hopefully should. It's shamanism, right? That you can pray, get the ancestors to join you in your quest. It's pure 100% shamanism, but it also is there. And that's why you have lots of Kabbalistically inclined Jews praying at gravesides, even though that's not necessarily something that would be encouraged by the Torah, because they see it as a way to bring that soul into their own. So it's all about showing that the soul is fuzzy and messy and complicated, and they don't really care about it being clean and systematic. They don't want that. They want it to be messy.
But I thought the soul was meant to be kind of your essence, like almost like your consciousness, the essence of what you are. And it sounds like it can't really be if you can have all these different souls in your physical body at different times. It sounds like there's sort of a very loose relationship.
Yes.
And there is no like proper essence of yourself.
That's right. I think that's right. And the notion that the soul is our true self is a very Greek one, ultimately, and comes more from Greek philosophy than it does from Jewish mysticism. Because in this tradition, at least, that's not really what they're saying, which is slightly unsettling. What they're saying is that during this life, you have, I often imagine it like, if you have like I know this isn't kosher in COVID times, but you used to have like grab bags of candy, right? Where you'd like reach your hand into a bowl that lots of other people reach their hand in, and then you put it in a bag, you take that home with you, right? That was how I don't know, amusement parks. So if you imagine that like your soul is that bag, when you're born, somebody scoops up a whole bunch of different things, which are all mixed together and from different places, puts them in a bag, ties it up, and that's your soul. You can shake it, it makes a little bit of noise. Right? So while you're alive, that's your soul. But actually, it's made up of lots of different pieces in there. And sometimes maybe there'll be a hole in the bag and one falls out, or maybe you add a bonus into the bag later. And when you die, the bag gets spilled out into the whole big bin full of gummy balls or whatever it is. Gumballs. Do you have gumballs here? And then next time you come back, you get a different handful scooped up and it gets put in a different bag. There might be some of the same pieces, but it's not going to be continuity. And that's, by the way, how they explain that you can have reincarnation and also have no memory of your past lives. If you lived so many times, then why don't you remember it? It's the easiest way to explain it.
So, Adam, may I ask, please?
Yeah.
Conventional thinking might be that there's a one-to-one correspondence between a soul and a body, and when the body dies, the soul goes off somewhere. But from what you're saying, the soul goes off into a cauldron of souls, which gets recycled as new bodies come along. Does that mean, or does it imply that there's a finite number of souls in existence versus a potentially infinite number of bodies?
That's right. So it's once again, it's not very systematized. So our quest for an analytical approach to it will result in failure. But
Sorry.
there isn't. No. But it's a very tempting desire. But there is a tradition based on actually in the Torah portion we're reading about Mount Sinai. It says at Mount Sinai there were 600,000 nefashot standing there. Now, that's not the normal word for people. It's actually the word that's more often used for something we might call the soul. So Zohar reads that hyper literally to say there's 600,000 souls standing at Sinai, and takes that to mean there's only 600,000 kind of mega souls, which are then subdivided. It's like a currency, right? As inflation goes up and there's more need for the system, the souls get split up smaller and smaller and smaller potentially, and they get organized differently. And they also see it that ultimately the goal is to put them back together, right? To find the pieces. So let's say, I have piece 1 through 10 of soul 347,212, and you have some of the other pieces, and there's other pieces out there in a tree and or a squirrel and whatever. Then ultimately the goal is to find all the pieces that match and to put them back together like a puzzle. And then ultimately that's the goal that they see in a cosmic sense, that everything will be fixed when all those souls are reunited and not split up in the condition they are. And
Sorry, carry on, sorry.
No, and each lifetime that you come back, the idea is that you come back with slightly more work done in order to put those pieces together, and you do a little bit more each time. So gradually we're working towards a state of wholeness, but we find ourselves constantly in a state of brokenness.
However, we could decide that actually we've got this big bundle of soul, and if we fancy, not that we, one of the, I imagine them as marbles, because I like marbles. You've got a big bag of marbles, and you can choose that, you can spare a couple if you want a bit of yourself to accompany somebody else, a member of your family or a friend or something like that. That could be quite a nice notion to say, I'm going to let a bit of my soul, because I don't need this whole big bag, but just for a period or whatever, to go off and accompany other people, or actually maybe I can have a bit of somebody else's soul and that will help boost me. It's sort of quite a nice idea.
Yeah, it is. And it does allow for that, although it's hard to explain how that works, right? The mechanics of it are impossible. The system allows for it, even if it can't explain the details of it.
Just a question about talking about you one coming back, but if there isn't this one-to-one mapping of souls to people, it's not really you coming back. It's bits of you.
That's right.
Recycling in different ways.
I think we find very upsetting, perhaps, which is, I think, a wonderfully frustrating concept, that you would come back, but actually you'd come back in a way that isn't contiguous, right? Because our desire in our lifetime is to see ourselves as a unique, special identity. We have a self, but actually the idea that this is promoting is that you do have a self. It's not denying that you have a self, but your self is temporary, right? Your self is as long as you live in this life, and then you will have another self, but it'll be different and made out of different pieces. Maybe some of them will be the same. Maybe you're particularly tasked with fixing soul 347,212, and so you need to keep bringing those pieces back. Maybe you're coming back to help someone else. Maybe you're, all of these different variations are possible, but what isn't the case is the more classical idea of reincarnation, which is that you have a soul. It looks like this, and each time it either goes higher or lower up the chain, right? That's the Vedic, the Eastern concept of reincarnation, that your soul gets either promoted or demoted depending on what you do. This is an idea of recycling, quite literally, which implies there is continuity, but continuity without identity, which is both comforting and terrifying.
I don't know if you can discuss this at all, but from my sort of very vague knowledge of Kabbalah and the Sefirot and things like that, each Sefira is meant to be like sort of, a plane of existence or something, as I understand it. And I sort of was once told that the whole thing about you have reincarnation, but essentially you're in each plane of existence, and like we're here, in the physical world, like at the bottom, and that you have to be reincarnated. Your soul has to be reincarnated, enough times that it's sort of done enough in one world to be able to move up to the next world or Sefira. Does this tie in with any of that, or is it sort of?
Yeah, I mean, it is all linked together, right? It's not a comprehensively, systematically detailed thing, but it is obviously very similar in the notion of progressive development, which, none of this is explained in this one short paragraph, right? Which is mainly meant to be an introduction to the story we're going to read in a moment. There's, so much to this that we could go down, but absolutely, The idea is that you kind of work your way through. It's almost like a video game. I know that's quite trite, but like, you start out at level 1, and like if you do the right quests that you're meant to be doing, and if you get the right points, and if you do the right places, then you gradually level up to level 2 and level 3, and you get better and better at doing it. And each time around, you are improving by your actions, if you're doing the right actions, the pieces that you've been entrusted with. And as a result, those pieces get closer to moving up the chain of existence and towards something that we might see as being reintegrated into God. Because ultimately we believe all the pieces of souls are God itself. And so they've just kind of been broken off, right? Someone like dropped a hydrogen bomb on a mountain, and we have all these pebbles, but they're meant to be a mountain. And so if we gradually find all the pebbles and put them back together and stack them just the right way, we'll have a mountain again. But it takes a lot of work to do that. And you can go backwards, right? You can be entrusted with a bunch of pieces, and then you do so much stuff in your life that actually those pieces go down as opposed to go up, right? They get further away from that stage of rectification, of tikkun. And as a result, more work has to be done. And the main thing, right? The main thing that's worthy of taking away from this text is that it doesn't explain to us how this works, because it's not possible to. Instead, it encourages us to just be in awe of the complexity of this system, right? How complicated this is, how great and supernal the cycles, right? How many revolutions, how many concealed actions, how the naked spirits that roam that world, right? These are souls without bodies. How many of them are there? How they mess things up, right? How humans don't know or notice, right? So it's the key thing is that we don't really get it. And although we might get glimpses of it or have a notion of it, no one can claim that they understand how it works. But if you accept the notion that a soul is a composite and that composite is recycled, it opens the door to lots of interesting ideas. Okay, now I want to read the story because I think it's great. It's quite long. So it's a little bit easier because it's not about teaching something, it's about reading a story. I'd like us just kind of go around and try and do some of the reading of it. So I'm going to call on someone else. Let's see who wants to read. Robin, will you read for us?
Sure. I need to shrink this. Rabbi Yehuda, son of Simon, said, "Happy is the one who strives to know about that world, the location of souls. Whoever is conscious of it and strives to learn about it, their wisdom is immeasurable."
Yes, this is the introduction to the story, which directly contradicts what we saw before. Right? This is praising someone who tries to learn about it. They're not saying you can, but they're saying it's a good thing to be conscious of it, to try and learn about it. So they're lamenting that people don't know enough, and also suggesting that even if you can't know how it works, you should try and learn and think about it, which is what we're doing tonight. So good on us. Our wisdom is immeasurable. Here's the story.
Shall I carry on?
Yeah, please.
Rabbi Parahia said, "As long as a body does not rest in its place, the same is true of its soul." He endeavored constantly to comprehend the world of souls. One day he was passing through a field when he came across a corpse beneath a withered tree. He took a closer look and discerned that it was a Jewish man with mitzvah windings on his person. A book of legends buried next to him.
Okay, I'll stop you there for a second, Robin.
Sure.
So we have quite a bit of introduction. Rabbi Parachia is our hero. Okay. And what we know about him is that he said this quote, this teaching, which is, as long as a body doesn't rest in its place, that means burial, right? As long as a body isn't properly buried, the same is true of its soul. So that means in the period of time in between death and burial, the soul is also not in the right place. The soul is dislocated, right? It is in some way in the wrong place, alienated, struggling. There's a sense of danger to this, which we think about in terms of how we as Jews observe mourning. We protect the body, we guard it, right? We also bury it as quickly as we can. We also have all sorts of superstitions to help the soul. The reason we cover mirrors in a Shiva house and spill out water in a Shiva house is not because you're not supposed to be vain, that's bullshit. It's because we're worried about the soul getting trapped in reflective surfaces, right? Because people used to die at home, mostly, and we wanted the soul to easily be able to escape. So we opened windows, covered the mirrors, and spilled out water because we thought the soul would get trapped in anything reflective, which is fascinating, by the way, psychologically, that your soul would get trapped in something reflective. What does that say about the soul? Anyway, right, we have all these notions about the danger of that in-between time. And we also learn about Rabbi Parachia that he was someone who was trying to learn about the world of souls. And we see, as you read, one day he was passing through a field and he came across a corpse. This isn't something that happens too often now, right? But in the ancient world, there wasn't a great deal of sanitation. There was no public services. People would often come across corpses, quite bleak. I don't want to time travel, by the way. I don't know if anyone else does. Wouldn't want to go back. And he took a closer look and sees that it's a Jewish man. How does he see that? Because he sees mitzvah windings. Don't know what this is. Either one of two things.
To fill in.
Either to fill in marks. Very good, David. All right, he may have seen on his arm the straps had left a mark. The tefillin had left a mark permanently. Or it could be that he was wearing a talit and he saw the tzitzit, which are also described as windings. Either one. I personally like the idea of tefillin marks, as you say. And he had a book of legends, a Sefer Agadot, buried next to him, right? That could be a midrash, or it could be something like the Zohar itself. And we see what he does in that moment. Now, I don't know if you think for a moment about what you would do. What would you do if you came across a corpse in a field under a withered tree?
Phone the police.
Yeah, phone the police. Good. Just checking. That's what you should do, right? Lest I lead you astray. Please call the police immediately. Identify yourself. That's not what he had the opportunity to do. And instead, he's studying it, which I think is quite interesting, right? He's observing, he's looking at this man, at this corpse, and making a conclusion about it, which is just very alienating for us, probably, but a really beautiful thing in some way. So carry on, Robin.
He remarked, "This must have been a scholar." He took great care of the burial and covered him up, went off to town, prepared shrouds and a grave. He assembled people for the funeral, wept over the man, tending to him, depleting all of his own resources. Once the corpse was concealed and buried, the soul of that man entered the heavenly academy. They said to him, "There is nothing for you here now in the place of the sublime rock. Go, compensate the generosity of the one who completed you."
Right. So not only does he find the corpse, he takes personal care of his proper burial with dignity. He goes to town, he covers the corpse, he prepares the tachrichin, the shrouds which the corpse is buried in, and he prepares a grave. Right? Those who are members of a burial society will know that's quite an expensive proposition. In addition, he assembles a minyan for the funeral. He weeps personally over the man, tends to the man's needs in terms of making sure the burial is done correctly, to the extent that he actually depletes his own resources, right? He goes broke, making sure that a stranger who he discovered in a field has a dignified burial. It's quite a dramatic thing, right? This isn't something most of us would do, right? We'd call the police and we leave it to them. So this goes to show two things about his character. One is that he's clearly a very pious, holy person, but also it's not an accident that they mentioned that he was someone who considers and meditates on what happens to souls. Because if he's someone who's thinking about souls, then he's thinking about the danger the soul is in because of the state of the body. Right? He doesn't see them as unlinked. He needs to take care of the body in order to make sure that the soul goes and is safely brought to heaven, which is what happens, right? Once the body is buried, that man's soul, we don't know the man's name, by the way, the man's soul goes up to heaven, and they said to him, that's probably the angels in heaven, we can assume, or some kind of heavenly being, "Get out of here, right? You don't need to be here. Nothing for you to do here. Go back down and take care of that guy who did such a good thing for you. Right? Go compensate his generosity."
Is there anything significant about the fact that the rabbi noticed that or assumed he was a scholar?
Well, clearly, he assumed he was a holy man, so he deserves even more so the holy burial. It's not very egalitarian. We would like it to say, no matter who he was, he's going to do the proper burial. But because this is a text by rabbis, about rabbis, for rabbis, the ultimate model is someone who's a rabbi and a scholar. So we have to accept that. But, it's also a sense of connection, I would imagine, because it's someone like him. Right? Obviously, Rabbi Prachti is also a scholar, and he recognizes a similarity in that. And there's a certain egalitarianism in that, there's no difference between him and the person he's looking at, other than one is dead and one is alive.
Why is the term rock used for God or whatever, or that bit of God in this piece?
It's a good question. Out of all, we have so many names for God, right?
Yeah.
Sor is one of them. Sor Mishalo, Sor Olamim, right? The eternal rock. It's an interesting question, especially when we think about this particular context. Not sure I have an answer, other than rocks obviously are a symbol of eternity, of kind of strength and perseverance, and it connects quite a bit to the idea of something which is going to last forever. But it's also strange for us because we don't think of rocks as animated, as having life. So it's strange to call God something which is inanimate. But maybe we're thinking about rocks wrong. Maybe that's what we should take away from it. Okay, so the soul of the man, we're going to have two characters, the man and Rabbi Brachia. We see up in heaven, I love this narrative thread, like up in heaven, we see the soul get sent back, and then the camera zooms back down to Rabbi Brachia on earth. So someone else want to pick up from one day here? Janice? I'm just calling up people randomly. Sorry. You're on mute though.
Can you hear me? So
Yeah.
one day, Prahara was at the Lida city gate, grieving over his stressful circumstances. A certain man approached him and said to him, "Rabbi, would you like to go to such and such place with me? I will give you silver vessels in return for engaging in the Torah together as one on the way." He replied, "Let's go."
So just to stop you, sorry. So just sorry to stop you there, Jez, but just remarkable, right? We have now the scene of Rabbi Brachia stressed out about being broke, being really upset about that, sitting at the city gate, which is where the poor sat to beg from people coming in and out of the city. And a stranger comes up to him and says, "I'll pay you to teach me Torah as we walk together to this other town." And not a normal thing. You don't just kind of pay for a rabbi to talk to you while you're walking. I mean, people might pay rabbis to not talk to them while they're walking to some extent. So it's quite a remarkable ask. And of course, you can feel the eagerness in Rabbi Brachia. Yeah, let's go. Right? By all means, let's do that. And then we see them walking, which is where we are now. And Janice, I hand it back over to you. You're on mute once again.
He seems to trust them immediately as well. He said to him, "Rabbi, what is the meaning of for the living know that they will die, and the dead know nothing?" He replied, "The living, that is the righteous, the dead, the wicked." He replied, "By your life, Rabbi, even in this world, the wicked are aware of their impending agony, and they know about the esteem of their righteous and the judgment of the wicked." There's a lot in that.
So, sorry to stop you there, Janice, once again, but just to make it clear what's happening, right? The guy who's coming along with him is asking him a question, as you do of rabbis, and he wants to know what's the meaning of this verse from Ecclesiastes. The living know they will die, the dead know nothing. Rabbi Brachia's response is very straightforward, right? When it says the living, that means the righteous, meaning the righteous know they'll die. When it says the dead, that means the wicked, meaning the wicked don't understand. The wicked people in the world don't think they're ever going to die, which maybe we can understand, right? We can understand what he's saying there. That righteous people know they're going to die and accept it. Wicked people are in denial about their death. But the stranger who has taken him on this journey doesn't like this answer, right? He rejects this answer. "By your life, Rabbi." That's a kind of, dramatic curse type exclamation. Even in the world, the wicked are aware of their pending agony. So clearly the wicked also know, and they know about the esteem of the righteous and the judgment of the wicked. So he doesn't think that wicked people don't understand or don't believe they're going to die. He thinks they do know what is going to happen and just don't care, which is a different interpretation of it. And now we have it's switched, right? He's flipped the script. Now we have Rabbi Brachia, the teacher, asking this stranger who hired him, "Well, so then what do you think?" Which is where we get to in the next bit here, right? He's asking him, "All right, fine. So if that's not what it means, what does it mean?" David, do you want to pick up for us?
He responded, "If so, what is the meaning of 'and the dead know nothing'?" He explained, "Scripture is referring to this world. The righteous, called living, see and comprehend that they will die, and they are prepared to give account. For there is justice, and there is a judge, as it is said, 'Let the living take it to heart.' But the wicked, called dead, know nothing of the affairs of that world. They are called dead, since this world is not for the living, theirs is in the world that is coming."
Okay, so it's a bit tricky to figure out exactly what he's saying here because he's flipping around with the language. But the point is mainly that the distinction between living and dead in this verse from Ecclesiastes is that the wicked, who are the dead, are focused on this world, right? They're focused on what they do in this lifetime, and that's all they care about. That's why they don't care what happens after you die. They know what's going to happen, but they don't care about it. Whereas the righteous, who are seen as living, are actually not really living much in this world, but living for what is going to be on in the next world, the world that is coming, which is a very vague way to understand any kind of afterlife. And this actually feels a lot like a lot of Christian ideas, right? That righteous people worry about the afterlife as opposed to material concerns during life, which usually aren't ideas that we see in Judaism too often. But as is often the case, we see things in the Zohar that we go, ooh, that feels very Christian. That's okay, right? Just you can see that and feel that and accept that. But that's what seems to be happening here, is that what makes someone wicked and thus dead is that they only care about the material life and not the life of the world to come. This dialogue between them about the nature of the verse is not really necessarily the most important part. We're going to see what's going to happen instead as they continue on their journey. But obviously the dialogue is about what's happening on the journey as well. David, do you want to read a bit more? Got some nice dialogue here.
When they arrived at a particular field, he said to him, "Let's tarry here," he groaned. He asked him, "Why do you groan so?" He replied, "For a lost object, lost in this place." He assured him, "The Blessed Holy One will summon it for you."
Okay, David, what's happening? Who's talking to who, and where are they?
I think it's Rabbi Parachia who is asking to tarry.
Okay. Which means it's the man saying, why are you groaning? Right? Why are you groaning? And Parachia says, something was lost in this place. And the old man says, don't worry, God will bring it right to you. I think you're right, probably. Anyone feels the other way, Rotem?
I think the other way around. I don't know. I felt like they're back in the field where it all started, where the man died. And then the man groaned because it's his death place. And what's lost is his soul or his body in this matter. And so there is actually the rabbi is saying to him that the Holy One will summon it for you, but he doesn't really know what he's talking about yet.
Right, which is I think you can read it either way, and each way can be absolutely correct. And typically for Hebrew, it's vague because it's all pronouns, right? It doesn't say the man, it doesn't say Rabbi Parachia, it just says he said to him. So you could be either one. I think both are really nice, right? Rotem, what you suggested is really relatable. This is the place he died. This is the field where he found the corpse, and he's feeling very afflicted by this. And Rabbi Parachia is going, what's the matter? Because he doesn't know the guy he's talking to is the guy who he found dead in that field. And as the listener to the story, right, you can just imagine that we as the reader are going, this is the field, that's the guy. But Rabbi Parachia has no idea what's happening. And him going, don't worry, right, it'll be found, the thing that was lost. It's just such a wonderfully kind of literary moment when he's talking to the person who died in the field about the thing that he found, saying, don't worry, it'll be found. It's beautiful to read it that way. I also think it works to read it the other way. I think it's wonderful that you can do it either way, right? Because you can see this dialogue between them as a conversation about what's happening between them as well. And it's about knowledge, right? Rabbi Parachia doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't know who this man is. He doesn't know that they're in the same place, it seems, and the man does. And the man also obviously knows that he's on a mission, whereas Rabbi Parachia has no idea. He thinks he just got hired to walk with this guy for a while and answer his inane questions. Okay, so it's wonderfully kind of characterized, unusual for Jewish text. We actually get some meat to the characters. Okay, let's carry on a little bit more. And Rotem, do you want to read a bit for us here from here?
I'll try.
Okay.
They came across a cavern. The man said, Rabbi, let us go in here. I know it. It's familiar to me. They entered, climbing down rungs until they arrived at an orchard. Orchard? Sorry.
That's right.
There they saw trees, all different from one another and from all other trees of the world, and one tree distinct from all the other trees. They clambered up and heard the sound of teeming legions intoning, come, let us bow down and kneel. Let us bend the knee before God, our maker.
Okay, just pause there for a minute. Incredible scene, right? We've got to use our imagination. So they've in the field, they stopped, one of them's tired, they come across a cave, right? And the man says, hey, let's go in this cave. You can just imagine Rabbi Prachya, who's like, he really needs the money. And he's, he probably is not too intimidated by this old man. But like, this is getting a little dodgy, right? Kind of stopping randomly, strange questions, and now they're walking down into a cave. But the man assures him, I know what's here. Which already, of course, us as a listener go, ooh, it must be something big, because this guy's just come from heaven, right? He has just been reincarnated with a mission to come back to Earth, and he must know what's going on in there. So they go into the cave, they climb down, and paradoxically, what's at the bottom of a cave? An orchard, right? Full of trees. And they had, each tree is different than every other tree. Now, anyone who's ever spent any time outside will realize that's not how trees grow, right? Trees tend to grow much of the same kind in the same place, maybe a couple of varieties, but you don't usually have every tree in a forest be a different species of tree, which is already obviously quite a magical sight, perhaps. And there's one tree in the middle, which is quite distinct from the others. Now, where have we seen before the image of an orchard full of trees with one tree in the middle that's quite distinct?
Garden of Eden.
Garden of Eden, good, right? Which of course is a metonym, a replacement for heaven in the Jewish tradition. We don't really have the idea of heaven. The idea is that there's access to the Garden of Eden for those who die. So they've kind of unwittingly, or at least for Rabbi Prachya, climbed in a cave down to the depths of the earth, and there in the least likely place stumbled into the Garden of Eden. They climb up the big tree in the middle. Clamber is to climb up. And at the top of the tree, they hear a sound, right? This, you can just imagine in your mind what this looks like. Space inside the earth. There's a teeming mass of legions of angels, it's clear, who are singing or saying or chanting a line from Psalms, one that we say all the time. Let us bow down and kneel. Let us bend the knee before God our maker.
Can I just say, if I was watching this as a film, I'd really, really, really annoy the people I was with by saying, you know what? I think Rabbi Perea died when he was at the gate, and this soul came along and took him to heaven, and actually he's dead. So
the whole thing's a dream. He's dead. Yeah. Spoiler alert.
So, and I just go, and everyone would go, why did you say that? So.
And then he woke up and went to work. The worst ending to any story ever is that it was all a dream. So absolutely, right? I think that's really important, Jackie. It feels like one of those stories, right? There's something absolutely fantastical about this, obviously, but Rabbi Prachya isn't dead. He's recounting, as the narrator in some way, an experience that he had. And we'll see that explicitly in a moment. Okay. So predictably, he's astonished. Yeah, Max, question.
Yeah, this might not figure either, but in the second sentence, or maybe it's the third one, they entered climbing down. Now, isn't the traditional thought that you climb down to hell and up to the Garden of Eden? Yeah,
I mean, traditional in what context, right? That's the way we think about it because of Christianity.
So what? Yeah, exactly. But so my point is, the Jewish religion doesn't think differently. They don't think that the Jewish religion does not think that climbing down is the way to the afterlife, do they?
Well, in the Torah, the underworld was definitely under, right? It was you went down into a cave often, and that's why we buried in caves, like the Marat Machpelah, the cave of the patriarchs. So the underworld was a real concept in ancient Jewish practice. The idea of heaven and hell as up and down is really a Christian thing, which we have to kind of do away with, right? The notion of the Garden of Eden and Gehinnom, which we're going to see in a moment, which is the language for hell, which means the valley of misery, basically. Those are not real physical places in the same way, right? We can't just walk to them usually. Okay. So the magical piece of this is that they went into a cave on Earth and came out in another realm of existence, basically, which paradoxically is down under the earth. It is strange. They go down to find an orchard where they then climb up a tree. Right? The up and down is confusing. It's kind of limbo, which is probably a very good technique for us as readers to get that sense of literary stuff.
Okay. Or are they going down because it's the world of the dead or the domain of the dead, like the underworld?
Yeah, it could be actually that, like the Torah, which thinks of the underworld as being down underneath the earth in a cavern, both the good and the bad part is underneath. And that's the more kind of authentic Jewish take on it, which is what we see here. And we'll see that as well in a moment. It says Max, but Kim, do you want to read for us? I don't know why it says Max. Have you changed your name?
No, it's it's kind of it's the first of two.
Okay,
Kim's
it's the both.
Yeah, I just like to confuse. Sorry.
All right, that's all right.
So we're starting with Rabbi Parahia.
He was astonished.
What is this? Silence, he replied. Rabbi Parahia recounted, by God, when I went with him to the middle of that orchard, I saw two paths with companies on this side and that. I asked him, what is this? He replied, here diverge the paths of souls, those going to the Garden of Eden and those going to Gehinnom. For one going to the Garden of Eden, these soldiers accompany him, completing him. For one going to Gehinnom, these bring him there for judgment.
Okay, so they climb to the top of this tree. They look around. There's this huge racket of noise of angels, and it's described in military terms, as angels often are. You know, kind of camps and armies of angels, and there's soldiers escorting two lines of people down below. An image that for us as modern people is very upsetting, by the way. Just, I don't know if anyone else reading this kind of had Holocaust vibes, but for me, that's immediately what kind of popped up was the idea of two lines, which I found very troubling. Obviously, for the Zohar 700 years ago, they had no notion of that, so we have to take it on his own merit. But there's a forked path. Some people are going this way, some people are going that way. And it's explained by the man. Rabbi Parachia never goes, how do you know all this stuff, right? He's just kind of with it now. By the man who says, well, these ones are going to the Garden of Eden, and these ones are going to Gehinnom, right? There are concepts roughly of heaven and hell, a good place and a bad place. Anyone watch the show The Good Place, by the way? A great take on these questions, just absolutely wonderful. Deeply mystical show, despite the great amount of humor. Who says mysticism can't be funny? Okay, so I mean, the story is remarkable, right? We're still on it. And also, I think it's amazing that in the midst of this, when we see Rabbi Parachia says, what is this? And the guy says, speak quiet. Then we hear Rabbi Parachia himself narrating, which tells us we're being told the story by Rabbi Parachia at the same time that we're being told about Rabbi Parachia, which just gives it a great kind of fireside feel, which I love.
That silence, I think it can also be read not as like a command, but as a response, like the answer to his question, what is this? This is silence, and although it's paradoxical.
Yeah, absolutely good, right? That's brilliant. And it's also referential, which might not be obvious, but there's a famous story in the Talmud about Moses time traveling. At Mount Sinai, he goes up to get the Ten Commandments, and he sees God attaching all the little decorations to the letters that you'll see in the Torah scroll. And Moses says, why are you bothering with this, God? Typical question you'd ask God. And God says, well, because there's going to be this guy named Rabbi Akiva who's going to come along 800 years later, who's going to interpret so much meaning from these letters. I've got to put them in there now. And Moses says, if he's so special, why don't you show me what happens to him? And so Moses time travels to Rabbi Akiva's Beit Midrash, his academy, and he sits in the back row, and he has no idea what's being said. He hears Rabbi Akiva teaching Torah, and he doesn't know what's happening, and Moses gets really depressed until he hears Rabbi Akiva say, this is what we learned from the Torah of Moses. And then Moses feels good because he goes, okay, I guess I must do something important if this guy, who God thinks is so important, is teaching Torah in my name. And then Moses goes back to God and says, if this guy's so great, then why don't you give him the Torah? And God says, silence. That's his response, right? Shut up is his response. And Moses then goes, well, what happened to this guy if he's so special? And God then shows Moses, Rabbi Akiva, who was executed by the Romans in the most horrible way possible, with his flesh ripped off with iron combs in the public square. And Moses says, this guy's so great, yet this is what happened to him. And God says, silence. And that's the end of the story. So there's this, which is typically rabbinic and horrifying. And there's obviously a reference to some degree here as well with that, which Zohar is aware of. Rabbi Parachia is just absolutely astounded at what's going on. He says, what's happening? And rather than explain, the person who knows, who in this case is the old man, says silence. right? That's the only answer which one can give in the face of such overwhelming complexity, which goes back to our very first notion that we saw from the old man of Mishpatim. Okay, Lee, you want to read for us a bit more?
Sure. We traversed the orchard and arrived at walls, towers, and gates. Upon our arrival at one gate, Eastern Gate, the man exclaimed, "Open for me the gates of righteousness." They asked him, "On what grounds?" He replied, "I've come as an emissary of the master of the universe." They all burst out, "Who permitted one born of a woman to this place?" He answered them, "This is Rabbi Perahia." They asked, "Is this the one who rendered you whole in that world?" And he replied, "Yes." They opened the gates for him and instructed, "Strip him, for one is not permitted to enter here with a body from that world." So they stripped him at once and clothed him in vapors of the inner garden.
Okay, just stop you there for a second, right? Amazing. First of all, just to go back, now they're walking through the orchard, and what do they encounter? A castle, right? A castle is also in here somehow. The kind of the magic of it is quite astounding. There was a movie from the early 2000s, which I don't think was a very good movie, but it had Robin Williams in it.
I was thinking of that as well. Yeah, What Dreams May Come.
Thank you. Well done, Lee, right? That was what it was called. I don't remember that it was a good movie. I actually remember it being very upsetting. But I remember that it was focused on this kind of imagistic, very paradoxical, very dreamlike vision of the afterlife. And that to me is what we're seeing here, right? They climb up this tree, they see the angels, see the lions, now they're at a castle, right? They knock on the door of the castle, and the old man chants out a line from Psalms, one that's familiar to us from Hallel, right? Pitchu li sharei tzedek, open for me the gates of righteousness. And the angels who are guarding the castle say, "Why?" And he says, "Well, I've been sent by God." That's not good enough, by the way. Evidently, I've been sent by God, because the angels go, "What about this guy who came with you?" Right? He's a human. We can't let humans in here. That's what it means, born of woman, right? He's a human. And he says, "Well, this is Rabbi Parachia. Don't you know Rabbi Parachia?" And they go, "Oh, is this guy that saved you?" It's like amazingly conversational chat between this old man who's been reincarnated and the angels guarding the castle in the middle of the underground cave of the Garden of Eden. And they go, "Oh, that's the guy." And he says, "Yes." And they go, "Okay, great. All we have to do is take away your body. Or you can't come in with a body, because bodies are of that world up there. So as long as you let us take away your body, we'll put you in some vapors, and then you can come in." Wild, right? But also quite an interesting idea that he's able to reach a certain distance into this kind of afterlife space. He's in the garden, he's at the tree, he sees what's going on, but there's some part of it he can't go into, right? He can't go into the castle until he gets rid of his body, which presumably implies that he might die. There's certain dangers. I don't know if you can kind of get your body back if you check it, like Coates at a concert, and then when you leave, you have the little slip. What if you lose a little slip? I don't know what happens. But that doesn't really matter, because that's not the point. Okay? So we get a little bit more, just the last bit here, about what he sees when he goes in there, which is equally as imagistic and bizarre and strange. Someone else want to read this bit for us? Maybe Martin?
Okay. So should I read from "They opened the gates"?
Oh, sorry, yes.
Okay, cool. Okay. They opened the gates for him and instructed, "Strip him, for one's not permitted to enter here with a body from that world." So they stripped him at once and clothed him in vapors of the inner garden. Entering, he viewed the firmament stretched over the garden, the firmament that had detached from the one arched over the rest of humanity. This firmament is bounded by a border of the full spectrum of colours. 4 paned windows open within it onto the 4 directions of the world, with one in the middle. This firmament journeys daily to the 4 sides of the world, and as it travels, it sprinkles dew of life into the garden. Then all the righteousness ones come there to bathe in that dew, shining like the radiance of the sky. Then they enter the presence of the Messiah, the ancestors and the first mortal, Adam. But I was not privy to those encounters.
Thank you. Brilliant. Where the 3 dots are there's actually quite a bit of the rest of the story that I cut out in the middle, which is him asking different angels and seeing different things in the castle, which we didn't have time to include. But the end, this last paragraph, is the end of the story. That's where it ends. Frustratingly, we don't see what happens. Does he get home okay? What happens after that? We don't find out. But we have more kind of magic fantastical images. Firmament, of course, now this is pre-Copernican science. They believed that there was a kind of crystal dome that extended over the world, and that was what we saw in the sky, was this kind of stars projected on this dome. And what they're saying is there's another dome that's been detached from the main dome, which we call the sky, which is inside this little indoor underground tree garden castle space. And it's surrounded by a rainbow, the full spectrum of colors, and there's windows in it that go out. It almost sounds like a spaceship, right? There's kind of this dome, and there's colors, and there's windows, and the windows have 4 panes, such specific detail about the windows in the firmament, the underground cave in the Garden of Eden. And the windows open into the 4 directions, and there's one window in the middle. I assume that's on the top, like a hatch, right? And then we see that the firmament moves. So this underground cave Garden of Eden space actually is not in one location. It moves around different parts of the world and sprinkles dew as it goes, and the righteous bathe in that dew, shining like the radiance of the sky. Just incredibly wacky imagistic language, which is not meant to be descriptive in a normal way, but meant to evoke a certain imagination in us of trying to conjure up this concept. And he says, by the way, there's plenty he didn't see. Right, those righteous, then they meet the Messiah, they meet all the ancestors, all the patriarchs and matriarchs, and they meet the first human being, Adam. He's in there, right? Everyone gets to meet him too, but I wasn't privy to those encounters, says Rabbi Parachia. So there's an extent to how far he could go. What do we think of this story? I realize we blazed through it quite quickly, but in light of our earlier conversation in our first text about how complex the workings of the soul are, and this wacky, wonderful story of Rabbi Parachia as a result of his good deed being rewarded with a glimpse into the complexity, what do we take away from this potentially for ourselves if we're people who are interested in understanding what happens to the soul?
Is it sort of meant to encourage you to kind of be righteous in this life because you know, you've got all this wonderful paradise to come?
Perhaps. I mean, there's certainly much positive about it, right? This image that we're hearing. And once you go kind of into that space, it sounds very nice. So certainly there's a kind of recruitment drive, perhaps.
I just am struck by this border of the full spectrum of colors, and thinking back to, at some point, the discussion of if we see God as white light entering a prism, and then it's expanded out, to think of that as souls as well, that, you know, it's gazillions all in the full spectrum of colors. It sounds really very magical. It sounds, it just, even without thinking of necessarily my soul, but just this concept of the firmament bounded by a border of the full spectrum of colors, that feels good.
To me, it's like, I see an allegory there where it might be saying that by investigating this, you're never going to see the full picture, but what you will see will be beautiful and also nonsensical in terms of your everyday life. Right.
I think that's key, is the absurdity, right? It is both incomprehensible, and yet you can go, right? Someone did once go and see it, but language doesn't really do justice to it, clearly.
I'm really, I don't think it's the like moral of the story, but I'm really, what stayed with me mainly is the kind of like the journey of knowledge. So we kind of start with this sentence that show us that Rabbi Parachia was very knowledgeable man. And then a few sentences after, we're talking about the other guy who was a scholar. And then suddenly the other guy comes back and he's like, can you teach me? So kind of putting himself in a lower position than the rabbi. So they're walking together, and suddenly we're getting this silence, and back this guy is up here and he's the one who has the knowledge. So I really like this, like playing with the who has the knowledge, and we end with this idea of I wasn't maybe knowledgeable enough, or I wasn't in this high level that I wasn't able to see the first man. And it just really struck me, this game.
That's really, I think that's a really interesting observation, and one that probably I wouldn't have drawn on in particular, but it's absolutely a big rabbinic idea that you have to be willing to say you don't know, right? You have to be willing to listen to other people in order to gain knowledge. There's a famous quote in Pirkei Avot, teach your tongue to say, I don't know, and then you'll learn, right? The best thing you can do if you want to learn is be able to say, I don't know. That's key. And we see that with Rabbi Parachia. He is willing to learn. He doesn't contest the man, right? He says, the guy asked him for his interpretation. He says, well, here's what I think. The guy says, no, I think it's this. And we don't hear a response. He takes that on board. And he asks him questions and he gets answers. And he doesn't respond when he's told silence, which takes a lot of humility, right? To have a really important question, literally life or death question, and your teacher goes, not going to answer it. And to not get angry about that, it's not easy. So it's a really interesting thing to focus on. Also, there's an allegory perhaps in even the geography of the story, starting above ground, going underneath into the cavern, climbing up the tree, going down to the castle gate, going inside the castle. Right? There's an up and down even to the narrative of the story itself, which very much matches that. Really interesting. What else? I'm just curious to hear observations on this. I'll share one more before we go in a minute, but I've done enough talking.
Isn't the tree of life itself? It was like, you know, the entering into the garden, and then all the colours are like the Sephirot. I don't know. That's how it certainly seemed to me, that they were moving it through the tree of life and then into and then he had a glimpse of the whole tree, you know, in kind of colour, in that kind of, not as an idea, but as in another dimension.
Yeah. Absolutely, right? The tree imagery is meant to be both part of the story and also a metaphor for the more common depiction of the tree in the form of the Sefirot, which we mentioned earlier as well, in terms of understanding the journey of the soul. Right? The Sefirot is basically a kind of diagram of existence from their point of view, and you can see the steps along that as potentially described in the story as well in different ways, if you chose to. You can absolutely read it that way. And the colors are definitely key to it as well, because you understand often the Sefirot is representing different colors. And in exactly the way that Jackie suggested earlier, that it's like a prism, right? One light goes in, many come out, which explains why we experience God the way we do, as often multiple different ways, as father, as mother, as angry, as compassionate. It's because experience from our point of view is multiple, even though the origination of it is singular. And that's a hard thing to accept. And we see that maybe in the story as well. I also really love the idea of all the trees are different. Right? Just like all the colors show up, each one of the trees in this huge garden is a different species of tree. It's like an arboretum. It's quite an interesting image as well for diversity. What else? Robin, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I don't quite know how to express this, but there's sort of, amongst all this sort of mystical and imagery and fantastical stuff, the end seems a bit sort of concrete. And you know, when you were talking about a world where the souls are all swirling around, and it just feels a bit simplistic and concrete, the thing at the end about I forgot what it was.
The kind of firmament jumping around to different places.
No, not that bit. The bit right at the end about people being able to see ancestors and stuff. It felt like that all felt allegorical and imagery that you can read into, and then you get these quite concrete statements about not heaven and hell, but the sort of afterlife being good. I don't know, there's something that I found jarring about that element of it.
I think you're right. There is something jarring about it. And I think it's, in many cases, mysticism is about trying to say something and acknowledging that you can't actually say it in words. It's the experience which can't be captured. And I think you see that struggle here. They're saying, you know, here's how it works in theory. It's so overwhelming, we can't even discuss it. But by the way, here's a story discussing how it happens, which is setting yourself up for failure, because once you put it in words, when you try and describe it, it's going to sound trite. And it does to some extent, right? Compared to just saying it's too complicated. But they can't resist the impulse to try and give us a story, which certainly I like, even if we take it with a grain of salt or a big heap of salt. My takeaway from this is what strikes me of this story is I in university I took a course in the art history department, not a very difficult course, entirely on depictions of Dante's Inferno in art, which is a great class. We just looked at all sorts of paintings of people being tortured. And it was the first time I'd actually read Dante in that class, because we had to read it. And our teacher insisted on reading each canto that we were looking at the art for out loud in Italian as part of the class, which is a wonderful experience as well. And one of the things that strikes me about this story is that it resembles so much Dante going down the levels and seeing what he's seeing with his guide, right? Virgil, the poet, who guides him down level after level. And what's interesting is what's similar and what's different. So similarity, of course, is the narrative of kind of going down and exploring and seeing what's happening and getting some glimpse into the afterlife. What's different is the specificity of it, right? And Dante is really specific, much more than you'll see the patriarchs. He's like, here's the cardinal from 20 years ago that did this corrupt thing in Rome. He's over there next to this guy, right? He names names. And he's like really just using it as a way to get back at people he knows in real life. And thankfully, that's not what this story is about. And the other thing I think is quite telling about this story is that the beginning part of it is so important. It's not just a fantastical story about a guy who explores heaven, right? It's a story about someone who understood the importance of burial and took the time, sacrificed his own well-being in order to bury an absolute stranger with the dignity that requires, because he was someone who contemplated the significance of souls. I think we have to go all the way through the journey and come back there. Because ultimately, thinking about the soul, thinking about the afterlife, thinking about reincarnation is actually really important. And it is a very holy thing, as we learned. But also, it needs to have actionable elements for how we live our lives. And if we take it seriously, the idea that the soul is such a complex entity, that it returns to the world around us, that we encounter the souls of people we've known, that things that are inanimate or animals have souls, it really does change the way we behave. And it should. It really should change the way we behave. The reason that Rabbi Parachia could do what many of us couldn't and stop to do what he did with that man's corpse is because he took these ideas so seriously and he understood the importance of that concept of the soul. I think that that's the big takeaway for us as well, is that we have to do more than just go on the journey and contemplate the significance. We also have to think about what it changes in our lives and how we behave and how we treat other people and actually the world around us if we see souls in so many places. If the world is full of souls, then we need to interact with the world a little bit differently than we do now. And I think that's really important for us as learners, is to be able to understand not only the theory, but also the practice. And that's something Dante doesn't include, right? He just wants to get back at his enemies. So I think there's a lot, hopefully, to be learned from this fantastical story about Rabbi Parachia and this brief introduction to the idea of Gulgul. There's plenty more where that came from. And we'll have many more opportunities to explore it, hopefully. But thank you for joining me tonight to look at this story. And hopefully you have some bizarre dreams of worlds above and below. And if you do, please let me know, because you never know where you might encounter.
Thank you very much.
Lovely to see you all. Thank you for joining me. And you've got the link and I'll also post it on our Facebook group and YouTube as well.
Thanks ever so much.
Thank you.